I have a spot on my face. I've put off recording this video for like a week and a half because I've been wanting for spot to go away, and it's not, so I'm just going to record it. It's my first video, I'm allowed a couple of cracks around the edges. People can deal with it. This is Mark Z. Danielewski, I think that's how you pronounce that. He's an author from New York City, and he's most famous for releasing a little book called House of Leaves in the year 2000. I say little, look at it. It's almost 1,000 pages long. House of Leaves is what I like to call medium famous. People who are into books are generally aware of it and tend to have a very strong opinion on it if they are, but it's not mainstream by any account. The thing about Mark is that he's a literary one-hit wonder. Even people who have read and enjoyed House of Leaves tend not to have given much thought to reading any of his other books. To an extent, I do understand why. There were only 1,000 copies in the first print of his follow-up, The 50-Year Sword, and 2006's Only Revolutions was more so a 720-page long poem than a coherent novel. But in 2015, Mark released another book, a book that was his most accessible yet most obtuse work to date, and a book that I would, and indeed am about to argue, is one of the most essential pieces of literature in recent memory. So I'm here to ask, why has no one read The Familiar? The Familiar is a series of 5 novels released between 2015 and 2017 and received exactly the kind of reaction that a new novel by a cult author should expect. People who liked it really liked it, and the people who hated it, really, really hated it. The Guardian's review of Volume 1 is one of the most bitter and scathing reviews I've ever read of any media. A novel that appeals chiefly to people who like to look at books rather than read them. The Familiar isn't a meaningful contribution to the world of literature, and it's hard to imagine why Danielewski would release a book so impenetrable and willfully obtuse. Wow, that is intense. I fully understand people who read one of Mark's works and don't like them. He's one of the most licorice writers out there. Either he provokes extreme love or extreme hate from a reader. I'm not here to convince you that The Familiar is good. I would very much like to do that since I personally love these books, but that's not what this video is for. I'm here to try and convince you that The Familiar is important, that if you're interested in auteurism, boundary pushing, or simply interested in literature, you owe it to yourself to read at least one of these books. Summing up what happens in The Familiar is actually a simpler job than I think most of the fanbase give it credit for. I've read quite a few fans try to pitch these books to other people, and they generally either super overcomplicate it or generally under-explain it to a point where you don't understand why it's so interesting. So here is a brief, non-spoiler plot summary of what happens to get you to the start of the first book. No contents, just the setup to the first book. The Familiar centralises around a young girl named Xantha. While she was growing up, she moved a lot around with her mother, but she had finally settled down in Los Angeles. One day, she and 8 other people, including her mom, her stepdad, a taxi driver, a police detective, a gang member, a fugitive scientist, a drifter, and an ex-drug addict, all start hearing an ambiguously distressed noise. Only those 9 people can hear it, and they all hear it as if they're right next to it. Xantha is the one who finds the cause of the noise, and that starts a Rube Goldberg machine of a plot, where the individual stories of all 9 of these characters start to circle in on each other. It's part slice-of-life serial, part detective thriller, part on-the-lam action, part philosophical musing on the interconnectedness of the modern age. That may sound like it's going to become messy and confusing, and admittedly it can be a bit much to take in the first few chapters, but Danielewski takes a lot of care to guide the reader through this at first, and it reads a lot more like an intricate braid than a knot of wire. Each narrator is colour-coded, and the ends of each chapter are time-stamped to help accentuate how it's all contributing to a single narrative. It actually takes quite a big cue from television in that regard. In television and film, thanks to the camera being a detached entity, you can cut from scene to scene and not lose track of a plot. If you think of it like that, with pages instead of a camera, you generally understand the structure of The Familiar. On top of that, he also takes a serialization of television. Each book is an episode with a self-contained plot that contributes to the overarching story, but remains satisfying as a standalone product. Plus that means if you read the first one and don't like it, you have a satisfying ending where you can leave the series and not feel like you've missed out on too much. Like I said, he's very licorice. If you've actually read The Familiar or House of Leaves, you may be surprised that I left the most distinctive element of Mark's writings to halfway in page 2 of my script. I did that partly because every review in the world of one of Mark's books starts on this exact same point, but mostly because I wanted to emphasise how palatable The Familiar is in comparison to House of Leaves. House of Leaves at a first glance is totally impenetrable. The Familiar is very careful to guide you in. Most discussions of a Danielewski novel start by defining the term ergotic literature, which is a term that I think both needlessly overcomplicates a very simple idea, but is also just in general a terrible term that no one should ever use to describe anything. Ergotic literature is generally accepted to be any work where a, quote, non-trivial effort is required on behalf of the reader to transverse through the text. Ironically, for such a complicated sounding term, it's primarily found in children's books, where colour, size, and any other fancy tricks are used to emphasise certain points, as opposed to simply just being black text structured in a grid on a white page. The Familiar is ergotic literature by that definition. For starting from simple stylistic choices, such as every character having a unique font, to the word familiar being printed in pink every time it appears, the book slowly begins to branch out into some really weird stuff. Intentionally large gaps, bending of space, constructing images out of the words, even complete language and style shifts at certain points throughout the series. Here's the thing though, none of this is any more effort than the typical writer asks you to put into their books. The non-trivial effort is trivial effort, and this is why I mostly don't like the term ergotic literature. But to explain why, I have to go on a bit of a quick tangent on what we do when we read. When you read anything, either fictional or factual, you're asked to interpret, but interpretation is actually done on 4 different levels. Language, symbolism, structure, and form. Language is the most obvious thing we interpret. Whether or not a narrator describes someone as a woman or a girl often says a little bit more than simply describing their age. Symbolism is also fairly obvious. The green light in The Great Gatsby is a symbol. It indicates something that is not explicitly stated in the text, but you're still supposed to understand its meaning. Structure is a little bit more obtuse, but it's generally done with where information is included and how it's included. If a public figure is writing an apology, it sends a very different message if they mention what they did right at the start than if they put it right at the end, or even if they don't mention it at all. That is structural interpretation. Interpreting form is the most obtuse thing you can do, and oftentimes most people aren't sure what form interpretation is. Form is in what state the text is presented to the reader. You can tell a story with the exact same language, symbolism, and structure, but if you tell it as a strictly laid out poem, it sends across a very different message than if it's free-form prose, or if it's a diary, or if it's an email, for example. Even within these, you can still be asked to interpret form. Even in free-form prose fiction, if a character were to receive a letter, the author has to decide, do you present that letter raw, or do you channel it through a character? That is an example of form within fiction. This is all that the format breaks of The Familiar really are. They're examples of form that Mark expects you to interpret. The reason that a particularly complicated set of pages in The Familiar looks bad is the same reason that the word disastroselectivity looks bad. It's a particularly extreme example of interpretation, but it is simply interpretation, and to do that you have to use the exact same tools you already have. Still not convinced? Here's a particularly small example from the books. One of the characters' narratives is told entirely in the centre of the pages. There's a lot of dead space around, and there's not a lot of format breaks in his particular sections. For the same reason that I interpreted his very direct and blunt speech as meaning he's someone with little patience, I interpreted the gaps around the text as meaning that he isn't particularly interested in the tertiary features of a task, and simply wants to get it done, a kind of tunnel vision. It really is that simple. So when later in the books, when the pages turn black or trees start being formed out of the text, you should already have a vague idea of what that might represent. These are all really basic examples of The Familiar's use of form. I've intentionally not spoiled some of the really interesting stuff further in the series, but I think they demonstrate my point well. Mark is writing with the exact same rules as everyone from Stephen Fry to Stephenie Meyer. Those rules are just a lot more flexible than you think they are. So I've probably convinced you so far why The Familiar is at least interesting, but not necessarily important, which was after all the key point that I led this video with. I believe The Familiar is important to read because society more than ever is in a place where we're communicating through text rather than through speech, and therefore the ability to critically interpret form is more important than it's ever been. Yet we have a serious lack of literature that really challenges form the same way we do for language, symbolism, and structure. Take this as an example. If you noticed your friend was having a particularly bad day, maybe they were particularly depressed or just weren't acting like themselves, and you decide to ask them, "Hey, what's up?" If they respond like this, that sends a very different message than if they choose to respond like this. Exact same words, exact same structure, but the form is different. Most people can pick up that there is a difference between those two when directly compared, but you don't get a direct comparison. You get sent what you get sent. And the ability to evaluate the form and assess the situation is important. Plus, social media itself is a form of form. Most social media sites out there have a general stereotype of what people on that platform are supposedly like. Reddit's full of radicals, Tumblr's full of crybabies, Twitter's full of morons, that sort of thing. All sites have strict rules on what you post and how you're expected to post it, and these will bleed into the messages of the messages. Reddit is perceived to be full of radicals because the site encourages direct discussion, conflict, and commentary. Tumblr's perceived to be full of crybabies because it's so easy to build yourself into a bubble on that website, where positive criticism is encouraged and negative is discouraged. And Twitter's one-way follow system and 280 character limit encourages very dense, nuance-lacking statements. The ability to critically think about the design of these platforms is form interpretation. You can read the exact same news story or opinion piece on all three sites, and if you don't accommodate for the differences in design, you will get three different messages. They may be subtly different, but you need to think about that. Reading the familiar won't magically give you the ability to understand all the nuances of form, but what it will do is encourage you to think critically of form, and helping hone that skill in such a unique way is something that I think is important. On top of that, the familiar is far more than just its form. It's an interesting and compelling story that touches on themes of family, technology, and the interconnectedness of the modern age. It stars a colourful cast of very interesting characters. On top of that, if you read it and don't like it, at least in the future, when very obnoxious Mark Z. Danielewski fans come up to you and tell you to read it, you can say you have. The Familiar is currently on pause according to Mark. The Volume 6 was supposed to come out in the summer of 2018, and while it is still going, so we do have some time, it's not looking hopeful. He cited poor sales relative to the overall workload as the reason for the pause. To give a bit of context, for 2 weeks this summer I worked as an intern at Penguin Random House, the publishing company that handle Mark. While I worked there, I was given access to the entire back-end system, so I could find a lot of the figures for Mark's works. While I was there, I found out that since its release, House of Leaves has sold roughly 40,000 copies, which is pretty good. Most celebrity autobiographies tend to sell roughly those numbers. Volume 1 of The Familiar sold 1,300 copies in the UK since its release. And Volume 5, 178 copies since its release. And to put that in perspective, I self-published a novella back in January, and I've nearly sold that many copies. So as much as it sucks that we'll probably never see The Familiar Volume 6, I do understand why, and I respect Mark for being honest about it. I'd imagine a lot of those poor sales simply come from how intimidating the series sound. I spent a lot of this video trying to demonstrate how accessible these books really are, but they do still look like an impenetrable block of paper that you need to be some super genius to understand. No matter how hard you try, the sentence, "a series of 5 900-page pieces of ergotic literature," is gonna scare away a lot of people. I mean, it clearly deserves some sort of special treatment because it's such a weird set of books. I can't think of any other massive set of epic books that has done well with a good marketing campaign. No, this is clearly a unique specimen. There's a quote by an animator, Richard Williams, that I truly love and I think sums it up quite well. "Once you master an art form, then you create your masterpiece." That's what Mark was trying to do with The Familiar. He was trying to create a masterpiece, something next level, something worth talking about. And I think even if you love or hate the books, you can't deny there is something classically epic about them. And I just want people to understand that. I want them to read it. At least the first one. Like I said, Mark is very licorice, and you will not necessarily love this book. But hey, it's worth a try.